Propolis is a somewhat obscure honeybee nest component, but don't let that fool you. It is incredibly important. In fact, scientists today are continuing to find different uses that bees have for propolis, and all of them are frankly mind-blowing, and how important this is to the honeybee nest integrity, but honeybee health and performance. So what is propolis? Well, propolis is that sticky stuff that shows up in honeybee colonies that beekeepers tend to hate. Bees will go to flowers, to trees, and other plants and collect rosins or saps that they bring back to the nest, mix with a little bit of beeswax and maybe a few other components, and then put in places around the nest. You typically see them deposited in cracks and crevices. You typically see them deposited around the nest entrance, usually the corners of the boxes, etc. All of this has led people to think, well, propolis's only function is weatherproofing, because bees put it at all the joints in the boxes. They put it around the bottom board, around the lid. Surely it's for the purpose of keeping out water. Well, maybe that's one of the functions of propolis, but it's not the only function of propolis. For example, bees will often cover up things that they cannot remove from the nest using propolis. So I've seen, for example, a dead mouse in a nest, completely mummified and entombed by a layer of propolis. I've seen bees do this with lizards and all sorts of things that end up in the nest that they just simply cannot remove from the nest. There are certain honeybee treatments that are volatile, that honeybees find noxious, and they'll try to cover those with propolis. So surely they're not doing it just for weatherproofing purposes. They're also doing it to cover up things perhaps that they find annoying or noxious in the nest, but they're unable themselves to take out of the nest. So that's an important function, but it's probably not the most important function. The most important known function of propolis is how bees use it for antimicrobial purposes. It's probably a colony-level medicine. So a lot of research has shown that bee colonies that use lots of propolis tend to have lower microbe levels than bee colonies that don't. In fact, there's some famous research where a scientist has scuffed the inside walls of the boxes of their hives. Bees would deposit propolis on these scuff or rough areas of the nest, and then those nests tend to be healthier. All of this is counterintuitive to what we as beekeepers have been doing for hundreds of years. We don't like propolis. It's annoying. It's the reason we have to use hive tools. It's what causes us to pry those boxes off the hives or the lids off the hives and have to work so hard to remove frames. So beekeepers have selected for bees that have lower propolis use, so we don't have to deal with all that sticky stuff ending up absolutely everywhere in our honey houses, on our bee suits and gloves, etc. Now, there's overwhelming evidence that it's important to the health of the nest. I've seen bees use propolis in ways that are really difficult to explain from a health standpoint, but look to be more from a protection standpoint, to keep maybe pests out of the nest. For example, I've done a lot of research in Africa, and you know, the typical honeybee hive that we use here in the United States has this long stretched entrance that's the entire width of the box and maybe a few centimeters high. Well, when we used similar boxes for research purposes in South Africa, bees would completely propolize the entrance down to something that was only a couple of centimeters, maybe a few inches in height and width, and so they were using it to restrict the entrance of the nest. We have photographs of bees nesting in cliffs where bees would go into this stone wall, so there's a stone face here and a stone face here and a recess in the cliff, and the colony would go in and form its colony in the back corner of the cliff. Well, when you look at the face of it, you can see the entire nest. So bees would build a sheet of propolis that's almost like the fourth wall of the hive. They'd build that sheet all the way down the face of the comb and leave a few small entrances at the bottom. I was in Thailand recently, and there's a couple of species of small honeybees there, Apis florea and Apis andreniformis, and they make combs that are exposed to the open. They don't nest in cavities. They hang them from tree limbs. And if you cut off these little tree branches, you'll notice that there's a ring of propolis that's a couple of centimeters wide on either end of the branch that's holding that comb. So bees collect and use propolis. Maybe, yes, for weatherproofing, but also for health and protection. It's an incredibly important substance that you'll see them depositing everywhere in the nest. Don't scrape it out. Hopefully something I've said will give you pause before you think negatively about bee use of this incredibly important nest component.